The question I get asked most often as a futurist is this: how did you become a futurist? And in my case, the answer is fairly simple. I was a university student when the university that I was at hired a new president whose name was Dr. Ed Lindemann. And Dr. Lindemann was, just prior to becoming the college president, the director of program planning for building the Apollo spacecraft back in the moon landing days. And he stood up in front of his first college convocation and said, "I'm a futurist." And I was sitting in the audience and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. It's a long story about how he then became a mentor. And over time, through a first career in higher education, I eventually struck out to be a full-time futurist, working with organizations who typically have this very same question. And the question is, we routinely think about the future. We have processes for doing that. But this time, we'd like to look further into the future than we usually do. Lindemann was a great teacher and a very charismatic person. One of the things that he said that is so apropos of this occasion when you are thinking about the 100-year anniversary of the company and therefore imagining the next 100 years, Lindemann, not long before he died, and he's been gone for some time, was teaching a seminar. And in this seminar, he said, if you don't go far enough back in memory or far enough ahead in hope, your present will be impoverished. We have this amazing human capacity to remember where we've come from and to anticipate or dream or, as you just heard, to imagine the future. And the kind of surprising thing is how little we actually do that. We spend most of our time with our heads down just trying to get the work done day by day, and we actually say out loud, I don't have time to worry about what happened yesterday, and I don't have time to worry about what's going to happen tomorrow. I've got to get some work done today. And yet, we have this human capacity to remember and to hope. The other thing that Ed Lindemann taught, which has formed the framework for my own approach to the future over the years, is this. When you think about the future, there are some obvious questions which come to mind. And if you use these questions as a framework, a mental model for imagining the future, you can accomplish some things that you would not otherwise see. There are three sort of obvious questions about the future when you stop to think about it. The first one is, what is probable in the future? What are the things that are likely to happen over the next 5 years or 10 years or perhaps longer that will have an impact on you or on the business or on this aspect of the business? What is likely to happen? And when you look at that, there are all kinds of trends which are relatively obvious when you stop to look at them. The second question is, and this is one the science fiction writers are especially good at asking, is what is possible? What are the things that might happen or they might not, but if they do, they'll have a big impact on us? Or more powerfully, from a company perspective, what is outside the boundaries of the way that we've usually thought about this business? About how we interact with each other, about how we communicate with customers, about how we either develop or promote certain products. What is outside the boundaries of the way that we've normally done things, that if we gave ourselves permission to think in this alternative way or to behave in this alternative way, we could see some new possibilities for ourselves? What is possible in the future? The third question, which Lindemann taught, is essentially the most important question. You answer the first two, what is probable and what is possible, so that you can come up with your best answer to this third question, which is, what is preferred? What is your preferred future? If the future is something that doesn't just happen to us, if the future is something that we do, something that we have the potential to shape, then ultimately the most important question is, what is our preferred future? From a personal perspective, that's obviously an important question. What is your preferred future for yourself 5 years from now or 10 years from now? What does it look like? And if you really committed to that preferred future, what would it mean that you should be doing now and next month and next year in order to make that preferred future more likely to actually come true? So those are the three questions: what is probable, what is possible, and what is preferred. Now, what I have done is to take those three questions and to shove them all into one larger and more general question, which I'm going to ask you right now. And in some ways, this is the theme for the morning. What is your image of the future? And I'm asking this question really quite literally. When you think of the next 5 years or 10 years or a longer time horizon if you wish, and you could think about the company, or you could think about your community or your region of the world, or you could think about the galaxy if you want to. When you think of the future, When you think of your image of the future, what is it that pops into your head? What picture comes to mind, or what single word, or what short phrase sort of captures part of your image of the future? And here's what I'm going to do. We're going to get you engaged with each other just for a little bit. I'm going to give you about 90 seconds, which at each of your tables will give you about 15 seconds per person to answer the question, what is your image of the future? I'd just like you to put your heads together at the table, and I'm going to ask for a half a dozen examples so I can hear what you're thinking. So the question is, what is your image of the future? What is the picture or the word or the phrase that pops into your head when you think of the future? You've got 90 seconds to turn to the people at your table and share some of your responses. Okay. And time is up. Time is up. Now, you could talk about this for a long time, I'm quite sure. And could I get at least 3 or 4, maybe a half a dozen examples? If somebody will raise their hand, you can raise your hand and say, Sally had a really good one. She should tell you what it is. But I can't see you very well because of the lights, but raise your hand or just holler it out. What's an image of the future that you had? Asia dominating the future. Okay, that's one. That's a pretty obvious one. What else? And I'm going to come back to that. Yes, right there. Opportunity. Okay, what else?
Brain transportation.
Say that. Brain transportation. I'd like to know what that actually means, but okay, excellent. Okay, what's another one? One more. How about over in this part of the room? What is one that you had over here? There we go. More green economy. Okay, so you have a number of different images in the room. And if you spent some time and were seriously asked to produce a preferred future image on behalf of the company, you could do that. Why is this an important question? The first question is, what is your image of the future? The second question is, why is this important? And the answer is, because the future creates the present. This is the opposite of how we usually think about things. We usually think that we make decisions and carry out actions in the present so that we can create the future. What I'm saying is that the opposite is equally true, perhaps more so. The future creates the present. The image of the future tells you what you ought to be doing today. I'll give you 2 quick stories. First story is kind of the negative story. A little over 20 years ago, Fortune magazine did a cover story on 3 significant companies. Each of them were pictured like a dinosaur on the cover of the magazine. Their names were Sears, IBM, and General Motors. 3 American companies who were very dominant and who had been named exactly 30 years before, said this article, by Peter Drucker, the great management professor. They had been named the 3 best managed companies in the history of the world. Sears, IBM, and General Motors. And the article 20 years ago was seriously asking, have these 3 companies have gone so far off track that they're literally dinosaurs in danger of going extinct? What happened to them? They each made a number of mistakes. I might say they've each worked very hard since that time not to be dinosaurs, although a couple of them are still kind of touch and go. IBM has gone through a major metamorphosis in order not to be a dinosaur. What happened to them? They each had an image of the future, of retailing, or the computing business, or the automobile business, and they focused on strategies that would make them successful in that future. Meanwhile, the world was going somewhere else. The retailing world was going somewhere else. In 1993, Sears was the biggest catalog company in the world. Who was getting started in 1993? A little company called Amazon. Amazon's vision was to be a store that sold everything. How is it that the biggest catalog company in the history of the world didn't notice that the internet could be the biggest catalog in the history of the world? They missed it completely. And so on. They had an image of the future, and the world was going somewhere else, either before they noticed, or much more likely before they took seriously what they were noticing. That is, companies are always full of people who are saying, hey Joe, have you noticed that the world is going over here? And what is Joe's response? Joe says, well, that might be true, but I'm retiring in 2 years. Just leave me alone. You guys can worry about that later. Or Joe might say, you know, we've got an awful lot of money sunk in, a lot of investment sunk in the way we're doing things now. We've got to actually play that out for a while. Even though, yeah, we can see that that's emerging, but we better play this the way that we're doing it now for a while. That's story number 1. Story number 2. Around 1990, I was invited to speak for an evening to 100 secondary school students in the United States who were in a 3-week leadership academy in the summer. The academy was being managed by a friend of mine who it turned out was a mutual friend of a young kid named Bill Gates. He was still fairly young then. And Bill Gates, quite surprisingly, said yes to that evening. So for 3 hours, I sat on one stool and Bill Gates sat on another stool, and we talked to these high school students in the United States about what the future looked like and might hold. Microsoft at that time was criticized as a company without vision. And I'll never forget what Bill Gates did that evening in front of those high school students. He said, look, at Microsoft, we don't believe that we can anticipate or predict what technology is going to look like more than about 3 years into the future because technology cycles are so fast. However, he said, and that means, he said, we have to base what we want to do more on our imagination than on our predictions. So he said, I don't know for sure that this is going to be possible, but this is the world that I imagine. He said this in about 1990. He said, this is the world that I imagine in the early 21st century. I get up in the morning, said Bill Gates, and I think to myself, I have some time. Well, the first thing that happens when I get up is I look at the pictures on the wall in my bedroom and I think, today I want Da Vinci. So I say, Da Vinci, please, and all the pictures in my house turn into Leonardo da Vinci. He later built a company that could do that. And then he thinks, before I go to work today, I'd like to go on a hike in the Grand Canyon. I don't have time to fly to the Grand Canyon, so I'll get on an exercise machine and I'll go on a real-time simulated hike in the Grand Canyon, and I'll have conversations with real-time simulated Hollywood personalities that I'm interested in. And I believe that artificial intelligence and machine intelligence will be good enough for me to be able to do that. Now that one turned out to be not quite there yet. But I always remember that evening, that summer in Seattle in front of those high school kids with Bill Gates, because I thought, here's a guy who, even though he's not known as an imaginative person, is clearly guiding his company by his imagination. The future creates the present. The most important question you can ever ask in an organization is, what is your image of the future? If you want to change the present, change the future first. Now, you have to do something a little bit more specific if you're actually going to shape the future, not just dream about it, but to shape it. And a few years ago, when we wrote a little book called Strategic Leadership, we did some thinking about, well, what are the core skills or mental models that one would need in order to shape the future? And there are 4 that jump out, quite obviously, when you stop to think about it. Number 1, you have to be future-oriented. Number 2, you should be vision-driven. Number 3, you have to be strategic. You have to decide what we're doing first and what we're doing second at some point. And then finally, you should be collaborative. Let me unpack these a little bit in the rest of the morning. Starting with being future-oriented. If you're future-oriented, you have to agree with me that the future is not a mystery. And this is contrary to what we often say to each other, right? We like to say to each other, well, who knows what's going to happen in the future? The future is completely unpredictable. We really don't know. But in fact, the future is not mysterious at all. It is true, and will always be true, so far as we can tell, that the future is never perfectly predictable. Something will surprise us in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years. Several things might surprise us in that period of time. But there are all kinds of forces and trends which are shaping your world and mine, which are relatively obvious, and the implications of which are relatively clear if you merely stop to think about them. Here are some that jump out when you stop to think about it from a business perspective. First of all, generational change. Second, the emergence of a knowledge value economy. Third, an environmental imperative no matter what business you're in. Fourth, technology acceleration, quite obviously. It just continues to accelerate. And then finally, intelligence in everything. Let me say a word or two about each of those. Let's start with changing generations. One of your images was Asia dominate. Now this is just a chart of the growth of the world population from now out to 2050. The big middle band that's kind of orange in color is Asia and Oceania. And it's quite clear that as the world population grows from somewhat less than 8 billion people now to somewhat over 9 billion people by 2050, despite some other dynamics, most of that population growth is going to happen east in the eastern part of the world. Africa, as you see on the chart at the bottom, is actually going to double in population, but it's not all that big a proportion of the vast global population, which is going to grow mostly in Asia. And that's valuable to know if you ask, well, where is the future really going to be? The second thing to know, however, is that the world population is not going to grow forever because of declining birth rates. This is the global fertility rate as mapped by a lot of different organizations. And if you are in blue on this map, now look on the map and where you're from. If you're in the bluish tones on this map, it means that your birth rate in that part of the world is less than 2.0. And if you're less than 2.0, eventually, not taking into account the potential of immigration, eventually your population will levelize and eventually shrink unless that birth rate goes above that. The only part of the world which still has a very high birth rate, as you see on the map, are the brightly colored areas of Africa. Now, if you're in the blue shaded areas on this map, if your population is not growing anymore, what does that mean? It means that your population over time is going to become gradually older and older and older, as reflected in this statistic, which I'm sure that you are quite familiar with. This is the world population growth separated by age out to the year 2050. People under the age of 16 are only going to grow by about 10% between now and 2050. Those aged 15 to 64 will grow by about 33%, but those over the age of 65 worldwide will grow by 181% from now till the year 2050. Now, what's interesting about that is that historically people lived to be 65 years old, but it was relatively rare. You can go back into ancient history and find stories of people who were 65 years old, but they were very rare. And as recently as just a little over a century ago, the average lifespan in the developed part of the world was only 47. Now it's very common to live to be 65. And in fact, it's pretty much expected that you'll live to be 65. And not only that, if you're in the developed part of the world, and actually most of the world altogether, if you live to be 65, on average you'll live about another 20 years. What does that mean in terms of the kinds of issues that you'll be dealing with when we think of brain function? We're going to live in this world which is much older. The way I like to describe it is that we are embarking on a grand social experiment. And the experimental question is, how should we organize everything when so many people are over the age of 65? Nation after nation, region after region, what we're approaching is a world in which somewhere between around 1/4 of the population will be over the age of 65. It's going to be true in China, it's going to be true in Europe, it's going to be true in the US. Just imagine, and this is true starting just 10 or 15 years from now, just imagine walking down the street and noticing that every one out of every 4 people you see is over the age of 65. That's the world which is coming. The flip side of the coin, however, is that there are young people. Now, I'm interested in this room. How many of you in this room, and I think there'll be quite a few, were born between the year 1980 and the year 2000? Raise your hand really high if you were born between 1980 and the year 2000. Oh, not as many as I thought. You're just very young looking. In this audience. Well, so who are these kids in the room, right? So the kids in the room are most classically known in today's language as the digital natives. It's a very large group. It is in some ways the dominant. I've just talked about the aging population, but in some ways this is the dominant population group because it's the biggest population group ever in the history of the world. It's bigger than the baby boom generation, for example, which has always been so famous. But what really makes them different is they are the first generation to grow up since what? Since computers. Born in 1980, right? From 1980 to the year 2000. So they were born since computers, since computer networks, and since the internet, and since the World Wide Web. And so what makes them significantly different is that they are people of the screen in ways that the rest of us in this room are not. Now, everybody in this room is highly skilled with machines like this. We know precisely what to do when we're told to download an app and to do this or that with it, right? So even though it wasn't there when we were little kids, we've learned how to use it. But we are not digital natives. We are digital immigrants. These kinds of tools were not there when we were little kids. And if you're a digital native, if you grow up doing this on a screen starting when you were 1 or 2 years old, which we see all the time, right? Then the world is different for you. And I can exemplify this, and it means that you don't accept old limitations on how things are done or why things are done. 2 years ago, I hired a new college graduate. She was straight out of the University of Washington in Seattle, where I live, to come into the futurist.com office, fairly small office. She was there for about 2 days, and I said to her, so what do you think so far? And she said, do you realize how backwards everything here is? I said, what do you mean? She said, well, your website sucks. You don't know the first thing about how to actually use social media in your business. She said, you don't know anything. She was right. She was completely right, but she was a child of the screen, a person of the screen who saw the world through new eyes, through different kinds of eyes. One other thing about this group, by the way, is that they are extremely brand loyal. Probably more than any previous generation, they've become more and more loyal to big brands because they can access information about them, and once they glom onto a brand, they like to stick with it as much as they can. So that's the digital native generation. One other thing to understand about the future of the population on planet Earth is this. We're moving to cities. And this is, I've been trying to think of what this might mean for the century of the mind or the century of the brain. And undoubtedly this is going to have some kind of impact, although I don't know precisely what they are. This is a map from a chart from the United Nations that illustrates that we have moved from being a rural civilization, which we were from the beginning of human civilization up until about the year 2007, to now being a city civilization. And if you look at the trend lines on that map that's on the screen right now, you see how much they diverge until we get out to the year 2050 or so, when the UN expects that about 70% at least of us will live in large metro areas. And this undoubtedly has meanings for all kinds of businesses. Economically, I'm not going to say anything about the performance of the economy, but one thing that's become completely clear is that we've moved into a global knowledge value economy where it's what a product or a service or a person knows that really matters. Now, I borrowed this term from a Japanese writer named Taiichi Sakaya, who wrote a book called The Knowledge Value Economy some years ago, in which he said, as we move into the future, more and more, the ability of any product or any service to compete in the marketplace will depend on its knowledge value. One can illustrate this best by pulling out a phone and saying, what happens if you go into a phone store today to buy a new phone if price is not the ultimate issue for you? What you do is you look at an array of phones and phone services and you ask yourself, which one of them is smarter? Which one was built by smarter engineers? Which one has smarter applications in it? Which ones will enable me to be smarter if I use it? Will this Samsung or this Apple or this Nokia or whatever it is, which one will make me smarter if I use it? And it goes so far as to which one will make me look smarter when I pull it out of my pocket or out of my purse. That's knowledge value. The ability of your products to compete is based largely, I would say, on their knowledge value. People look at them, your customers, that is physicians and so on, look at them and ask, was this built by better engineers? Was this built by better scientists? Is there better science behind this? Is there better knowledge value? Can I get better customer service if I work with this company rather than that company? Will it make me smarter if I work with them? That's knowledge value, and that is the nature of all economic activity going forward. It can be illustrated one more time by the fact that in a knowledge value economy, things become increasingly dematerialized. I went into Copenhagen on Sunday. I took Uber to come back out to the hotel because I just wanted to see how Uber in Copenhagen works. Uber, as of a week ago when I made this slide, was worth $40 billion, even though it owns nothing except an app. However, Uber is now worth $41 billion. It's gone up $1 billion in the last week. And on the right side, the app that you see there is Airbnb, which is now more valuable than Hilton Hotels, even though Airbnb owns nothing, owns no property. It just enables you to rent your home or your room to somebody who is coming through town on vacation or on a trip. That's a dematerialized economy. I mentioned the environmental imperative. I'll pause for just a second so that you can read this little cartoon for yourself, which I always like. And I thought I would use this cartoon since we're here in Denmark, one of the hotbeds of environmental action in the world. What if it is all a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Every business is an environmental business. And what I mean by that is every decision that Lundbeck makes from now through the rest of the century is going to be evaluated partly on an environmental basis. If you build a new plant, they're going to ask, is that plant sustainable? If you build a new office building, they're going to ask, you're going to be required to demonstrate that it is sustainable. If you have new communication activities, new travel policies, everybody's going to ask, is that a sustainable travel policy? We are all being judged on whether we are sustainable or not. It's a good thing. But it doesn't matter whether you think of yourself as a green business or whether you're in some kind of green production business at all. Everybody is required to be environmentally sustainable today. The last trend that I'm going to mention as a meta trend is this one, and that is the emergence of the acceleration of technology. And this is, I'm going to say the least about this because you're the most familiar with it. But across the top, you have all the most familiar technological development areas: nanotechnology and biotechnology and information and robotics and science and cognitive technology, which is, in fact, all of the research that's going on into brain function that has really been only happening, especially in the last 5 years or so, as both companies and foundations and, in fact, governments like the US government are pouring lots of money into brain research. At the bottom, we have 3D connectivity and convergence. And we know that all communications is characterized by that. But what is pulling that all together is this new term that you probably are familiar with called the Internet of Everything. This is the term that Cisco coined for what's going on. And Michio Kaku foresaw this when he wrote the following, and he's a physicist who wrote the following. In the next 20 years, PCs will be replaced by millions of tiny intelligent systems embedded in our clothes, jewelry, cars, furniture, and walls. They'll recognize voice commands, carry out our simple wishes. They'll cost less than a penny, less than a scrap of paper. So companies that don't put chips or intelligence into all their products will be at a severe disadvantage. Now, Kaku wrote that in 1998 as he was writing a book anticipating how science would revolutionize the 21st century. So now we are 3 years away from his prediction. These chips or intelligence that are going into the Internet of Everything cost more than a penny, more than a scrap of paper, but they don't cost very much. And as of today, the latest number is something like 70 billion devices. I'm not talking smartphones and computers. I'm talking small devices that are on the internet and communicating with each other and with us wirelessly or through the wired internet, and enabling us over time to move into an era characterized by this phrase: a platform for devices to communicate with the world around them and to integrate the human, the natural, and the built worlds. That's the Internet of Everything. What it means for you is that when things are smart, healthcare will change. This is a bed actually already being sold by Sleep Number that will measure your sleep behavior and gradually adjust the bed itself to enable you to sleep better night by night. This is the bed that can change how hard or how soft that it is, and it is now enabled to do that automatically depending on your sleep cycles. When things are smart, we'll have all kinds of health monitoring devices. Of course, when things are smart, we might have smart pill bottles, and we might even have smart pills. And perhaps we'll have accelerometers to go into athletic helmets of all kinds, measuring every blow to every brain that happens in any athletic contest, so that we know how much a particular athlete has received in terms of a blow to the head, so that we don't have to depend on a coach saying to an athlete, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" Instead, a physician on the team sideline can just look at the readout of all the blows that are happening on every play in a particular athletic contest and say, okay, this player has to come out of the game because they've gotten too hard a blow to the head. That's a world of the Internet of Everything. What about the future of health and medicine as we look ahead, in particular as it relates to the brain? And for this material, I'm going to borrow a couple of material from a couple of sources. First of all, the Paul Allen Brain Institute in Seattle, where I'm from, and then second from the medical school at the University of California in San Francisco, who did a really nice piece on the key future trends shaping medicine. I'm borrowing from the two of them so that I can say something specific to you about your field. First of all, we are now in the era of hacking the brain. And this has three different meanings, which I think are quite interesting. Number one, we are hacking the brain. Alibaba is doing this, and Google is doing this. Hacking the brain so that we can make computers that are more like the brain. For example, make computers capable of recognizing cats on the internet. Now, this doesn't sound like a very sophisticated thing to do, but in fact, when you can make a machine that can recognize not the word cat, but actually pictures of cats just by looking at all of the pictures on the internet and know that that's a cat and that's not a cat, but that's a cat over there, you've made a very smart machine that comes closer to being able to mimic the brain because we're becoming closer to understanding how the brain actually works. That's meaning number one. The second meaning is hacking the brain to understand all the brain connections. This is a map of the mouse brain recently published by the Paul Allen Brain Institute, in which they used today's computing power to map all of the connections among all of the 71 million neurons in a mouse brain. And they did this using a virus to go into the brain and then tracking the movement of the virus through the connections over a period of time. They did several thousand mice. And this is a map, really, of all the connections among all of the neurons in a mouse brain, which is a first step toward truly being able to map the human brain. But the third meaning of hacking the brain is this, and it's quite interesting. We've been able to implant electrodes into the brain for many, 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 many years, decades. But now there is speculation that we'll be able to plant electrodes or implants into the brain that are not a few dozen connections, but hundreds or even thousands of connections in the brain, and then be able to potentially treat or perhaps even cure, using brain implants, diseases like Alzheimer's or some others. And so it is possible to imagine a future in which we treat certain kinds of brain diseases not with pills or with drugs, but with electricity, basically, with electrodes, by understanding the map of the brain and changing the DNA. The second thing that we're doing is being able to diagnose through DNA. And this picture is also from the Paul Allen Brain Institute, and it's a heat map of the DNA of basically 4 human brains that they have completely decoded in terms of its DNA structure. And if it's blue, it means the DNA expression is essentially identical. And if it's in the orange or hotter colors, it means the DNA expression differs across regions and across brains. The bright blue area in the upper left is the cerebral cortex. And it turns out, perhaps not surprisingly, that the DNA expression in the cerebral cortex is identical. Or virtually identical across brains, and that's really quite interesting. And this is enabling us to think more about using DNA for diagnosis of certain central nervous systems diseases. There's recently a case study that came out of the University of California, San Francisco, of a 14-year-old boy who had symptoms of spinal meningitis, but none of the traditional tests would confirm that that was the case. And they decided to do a DNA analysis of his spinal fluid. So they did a complete DNA readout of the spinal fluid, and they found human DNA, viral DNA, and bacterial DNA. And by being able to identify the specific bacterial DNA, they were able to confirm a diagnosis, in this case of spinal meningitis, which leads to then speculation about being able to use DNA analysis, which can be now done within 24 hours, to do medical diagnosis, much more precise diagnosis. Imagine being able to diagnose what's happening in the brain or anywhere else in the body by comparing the DNA and figuring out whose DNA is really in there. That's a whole new field, diagnosis through DNA. The third of 5 healthcare trends that are quite interesting is global teamwork. A recent research study on Alzheimer's combined the work across 50 commercial labs and numerous universities. And this is an interesting challenge, I would think, to the commercial pharma business. If the future of medical research, including brain research, is primarily a team-oriented one, including all kinds of data being published by people like Paul Allen who have no product to sell, and who are only interested in spreading knowledge as fast and as widely as they possibly can, what happens to the concept of IP? And what happens to the future of drug development in a world in which everything is shared more widely and is expected to be shared more widely? That is expected to be a trend in medical research. Rejuvenation through young blood sounds kind of ghoulish, but there are some very powerful studies being done with mice in which they take old mice and run young blood through these old mice and discover that their cognitive abilities increase significantly, as do their heart function and liver function. And there is currently, I am told, I've read, a small clinical study being done, again on Alzheimer's, using young blood as a treatment. And what if that becomes part of the future of the way that we treat all diseases? If nothing else, this would be a great storyline for science fiction writers for the next few years, as all of us oldsters harvest all the young blood in the world. The last one is systems pharmacology. And by systems pharmacology, what the people at the University of San Francisco Medical School meant was not using systems knowledge to do research on pharmaceuticals, but to use systems knowledge to research the impact of pharmaceuticals on the whole body system. We learned just in the last few decades how certain pharmaceuticals impact certain receptor sites. And what systems pharmacology is all about is how does it impact everything else? And there's an expectation that as you all go forward in this kind of industry and research, the question will be more and more is not the impact of a particular drug on a particular thing, but what is also its impact on everything else in the whole system. So those are some of the health trends which are expected to be shaping the future. Now, if you're going to be future-oriented, you have to review your lessons from the future. I think if you look at the future, what happens is the future has certain lessons to teach us. And to review what I've just shared, first of all, population dynamics drive business. Second, knowledge value drives the economy. Third, technology will simply continue to accelerate. Fourth, everything becomes intelligent, including the things that you make and the processes by which you sell them. And then finally, health and medicine is clearly moving upstream and becoming more systems intensive. When I thought from my futurist perspective, not from your professional perspective, from my future perspective, what healthcare opportunities would I really see? This is what I see: enhancing brain focus and understanding. Clearly that is an agenda for this century, in this century of the mind. That's clearly the case. Turning health data, under which we're going to get just deluged as we go through the next few years, turning that health data into wisdom and into effective products. Developing an infrastructure to personalize health. There has been this dream, this imaginative dream of the day that we could provide a treatment for you and a different treatment for you and a different treatment for you, rather than the same, essentially the same treatment for everybody. And developing an infrastructure to make that more true, I think, is clearly part of the research agenda. Embracing whole systems perspectives. And finally, as in fact Andrea said at the very beginning, has been true for the company in its 100 years and must be true for the next 100 years, and that is to embrace the courage that it takes to go for potential breakthroughs, even if it's different from what you're doing today. A few years ago, I was reading a book on the about the creation by a company called the DEC company, the Digital Equipment Corporation. Doesn't exist anymore, but they built the first internal company network. And a really good story was written about that process. And the person who led that effort to build the very first computer network back in the 1980s was asked by the author of this book, did you know what you were doing when you set out to do this? And his answer was really powerful. He said, we believed it was a really important vision to pursue, but we didn't know how to do it. In fact, he said, at most, we probably knew about 15% of what we needed to know about how to accomplish this vision that we had of building a computer network that would knit together 70,000 worldwide employees. And from that, I deduced or wrote my own rule, and I call it the 15% rule for a preferred future vision. Remember, to shape the future, you've got to be future-oriented, you've got to be strategic, you've got to be collaborative, and you have to be vision-driven. And that vision, if it's going to be powerful, has to meet the 15% rule. If you know more than 15% of what you need to know about how to accomplish your vision, it's probably too timid. That's the way that I wrote it. Now, I was doing a project with the city of Atlanta, and they were looking at Atlanta, a 50-year vision for the city, Atlanta 2060 at the time. And the Atlanta newspaper wrote a little article based on my speech about the 15% rule. And a consultant friend called me up who read the article, and he said, how do you know it's 15%? And I said, I don't, I just made that up based on a story that I read. But I said, so maybe it's 50%. Or maybe it's 25. I don't know what the right percentage is, but I do know this. If you're creating a vision and you're ratcheting it down to be more and more cautious until you're quite confident that you know everything you know about how to accomplish the vision, all you've really done is create something that's quite boring and meaningless and won't have any impact on anything. The great visions always are things that when you start on them, you don't know how you're going to accomplish them, but you believe that you should try. When Bill Gates started Microsoft, his vision was a computer on every desk. When Howard Schultz started Starbucks, his vision was a third place that everybody could go to. When Jeff Bezos started Amazon, his vision was a store that sold everything. None of them knew exactly how they were going to pull those visions off. My favorite vision of all, though, is one that I think has some instruction for you, and that's from Steve Jobs. How many of you know the original Steve Jobs vision for Apple, who I still think is probably the most visionary company in the history of the world? When Steve Jobs started Apple, this was his vision. He said, I want to make tools for the mind that will enhance humankind. I want to make tools for the mind that will enhance humankind. I'm sure he didn't know what those tools were going to look like. I'm sure he didn't know how he was going to do it, though he probably had some glimmers. If you're going to have a new vision for Lundbeck for the next 100 years, can you come up with a vision that will meet the 15% rule? In the end, at the end of the day, the future is not something that just happens to us. The future is something that we do. And the real challenge going forward is, what kind of future do you really want to do here at Lundbeck? Thank you very much for having me at your meeting.
Thank you, Glenn. Very inspiring. We have 5 minutes time for some questions that we received already. Was a few that came in, and please feel free either to raise your hand, that may be the easiest, or submit as part of the app. I will receive them here live on stage. That's a tricky question, but Glenn, what is a trend that you're aware of, however many are missing? So I think now is there anything that
a trend that I'm aware of that you would not know about? Well, this is one that you sort of vaguely know about. Cars you will probably not be allowed to drive a car by about 2030. At least your insurance company won't allow you to actually drive it, because it'll be so much safer for the car to drive itself. They can see so much better, they can react so much faster. While 15 years ago I predicted that by now we'd all be driving hydrogen fuel cell cars, and I was wrong. Right now I think that by 15 years from now we'll be riding around mostly in driverless vehicles, robotic driverless vehicles. And so we sort of know about that, but we don't really get how significant it is. The other one that we were discussing this at breakfast that I think would be of interest to you, many futurists say that one of the biggest threats to the world is a global pandemic that gets out of control and kills most of the world population, as the flu epidemic did 100 years ago. I actually disagree with that. I think that researchers in your kinds of fields, that is in medical research, are so good, and our communication systems are so widespread that it's very, very, very unlikely that any kind of pandemic would get out of control and would not be contained. It could be very dangerous, and I'm not to say that it would be insignificant, but the idea that it could wipe out humanity is pretty far-fetched. So those are a couple.
Here's an interesting question. What is the relationship between innovation and the future? Maybe even related to the pharma industry, where we spend a lot of money in research, and obviously innovation happens in the labs. Maybe it happens somewhere else. It happens in academic institutions, in small startups. How do you see that relationship in general?
Well, the relationship is essentially a one-to-one relationship. If you're talking about creating a preferred future or shaping the future, typically you're talking about trying to come up with some innovation, either an innovation in a product or an innovation in a business process. And so engaging in innovation exercises is one of the most powerful things that you can do to shape the future. And we use a lot of what I would call futuring techniques or technologies, which essentially means exercises in which people get together and dream up ideas together. And it's the very same kind of thing as innovation. But this field is an interesting one as I've studied it just a little bit. The fact that it's becoming harder rather than easier to innovate new products in your field is an interesting observation. More expensive, longer time periods, when the technology curve suggests it ought to be faster. We ought to be coming up with things more quickly. And I don't know all the dynamic reasons about why it's so difficult. Obviously there are regulatory reasons and so on. But we ought to, in the medical field, be able to innovate more quickly than we are.
In a group of people, I mean, even when you asked here the questions around how do you envision the future and what is your image of the future, what is your experience with creating a common vision for a company? Can you do that bottom up, or is it a top down approach, or how do you align in a way, an organization to the direction that we are taking?
I have lots of experience in lots of companies doing it in both ways. You can do a bottom-up process. There are technologies for getting groups this big together, having them generate some ideas, and eventually build all that up. The more common experience is to have some kind of a task, some kind of a group task. It might be a cross-sectional group. It might not be only a management group. To generate ideas and then to spread that out, get feedback. You can do that over networks and face-to-face meetings. The idea is at the end of the day, everybody has a chance to say, this is my dream and how it fits in with the larger company dream that you can embrace. But it can be done. It's a very exciting process. And it isn't, at the end of the day, it's less about coming up with a vision statement or a real specific idea than it is about coalescing around the concept of shaping the future and a broad sort of dream of moving ahead. That's why I love the Steve Jobs vision so much. It's, to create tools for the mind that will enhance humankind. It's such an open vision, and yet it's so alluring. It sort of draws you in. But that can be done. And the most common experience is somewhat top-down, but using a cross-section of people and then a way to communicate and involve everybody at some level.
How do you move an organization from, in a way, catching up with the future to leading the future?
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, you have to, number one, senior leadership has to decide that it's important. This is one that if you're in a company where senior leaders don't commit to it, it's not going to happen. I remember in my early consulting life, early 90s, I was working with I will leave it unnamed, a large aerospace company. And we had a group of people, and we created a really dynamic vision for what was called total quality at the time. And the senior manager in charge of the whole program, at the end of our several-week effort in our closing 3-day retreat, we walked down the hall. He was a big guy, bigger than me, and he put his arm around my shoulder. It's an absolutely true story. I tell it in my book. He put his arm around my shoulder, and he said, "Glenn, that was a fantastic process, and I really appreciate all the ideas from all those people, but I want you to know something." And I said, "What?" He said, "We're not going to do one single thing of those ideas because I'm going to make sure that we don't." Because he said, if we did, I'd lose my job, and I'm not going to lose my job. So he said, "I'm going to make sure this does not happen." And I just want you to know that. And I thought, wow, that's a lesson. That's a lesson that really controls things. So number one, senior leaders have to, if you're going to actually break through into something really new, senior leadership must commit to it. The second thing is, I said there were two. The second thing is, at some point, and this is really hard, you have to decide what to let go of and what to stop doing. And that's a real challenge.
In the interest of time, is one question that is relatively broad, but maybe you can share with us your vision or ideas around the pharma industry. You're not an expert in the pharma industry, realizing what is the vision for the pharma industry as it is today? What is it that? Okay,
I would say three things. One of which I've been familiar with for a long time. Many years ago, I got to appear on a panel in which I met Leroy Hood. I don't know if that name means anything to you. Leroy Hood he was one of the key players. He actually invented the machine that enabled the speeding up of the human genome project. So he's a biologist, scientist, and he now has the set up in Seattle. And Bill Gates brought him to the University of Washington to be the Bill Gates Professor of Systems Biology, and they later left the university and now runs the Institute for Systems Biology. And he, at that time, for the last several years, has been promulgating a vision for healthcare. And it is a vision which healthcare should become, it's a 4-part vision, I'll see if I can remember it right. It's predictive, personalized, participatory, and there's one other P. What's the other P? But essentially, predictive in terms of rather than waiting for something to happen and then trying to fix it, predict ahead of time that it's going to happen and fix it before it happens. Personalized, which I already mentioned, that is being able to treat Jane differently from Joe, even though the name of the disease is the same. They are different people, and therefore we ought to be able to treat them differently. And then it ought to be more participatory. People ought to be able to participate in more. And I think those are really quite powerful as a vision of where, even in the area of the treatment of brain diseases, that we ought to go. And the second, I was really quite taken with this brain hacking idea, because course, when I come to speak to a specific industry, I try to read a whole bunch on what's going on in the industry, and the hacking of the brain. I've been familiar with that as the concept of just understanding the brain, but the idea that we might actually take a lot of brain, whether it's brain or central nervous system problems, like whether it's anxiety or whether it's depression or whether it's Alzheimer's, and treat it not with drugs but with some other kind of brain implant, is one that I really hadn't thought very much about. And I don't know if you're thinking very much about that, but it could be that the treatment of brain diseases will look substantially different 20 or 25 years from now based on having hacked the brain as thoroughly as we will have done that over the next 20 or 25 years. And so we might look back at this era of the treatment of brain diseases and say, that was kind of primitive, what we were doing back then. And we know, we know how to hit this particular neuron that has this particular gene sequence attached to it, and just do that. I think that's to me that's an incredibly exciting, although of course somewhat uncertain future. So thank you very much for having me. Have a great conference here.